Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James John from Renmark Irrigation Trust, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third iteration of the Renmark Irrigation Trust History Festival event. Nice to see quite a few return attendees here from our last few years of events, so thank you for joining us again for what is certainly an interesting topic today. Firstly, the Renmark Irrigation Trust acknowledges the Irrwarung as the first peoples of the lands where we live and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and respect their cultural heritage, spiritual beliefs and their relationship to lands and waters. Now, before I introduce our topic and panel, some general housekeeping. We have toilets, bathrooms towards the back corner over there. In the event of a fire or other emergency, please follow the exit signs and directions of our lovely library staff to the lawned area in the Jarrett Gardens adjacent to the playground. Some thank yous. A big thank you to Staff Trust Member Dr. Judy Bailey and Resident Trust Historian Jeff Bull for driving this event again. We appreciate you very much. Thank you to our wonderful Renmark Paringa Council library staff for facilitating this event each year with the promotion, excellent registration, setup and facilitating this. We appreciate you. And to Clint and Keymaker Marketing for the recording they do. We appreciate you. So on that recording front, we will record today's session and it will be made available with a link on the Trust Facebook page and website. You can also register your interest through some of these forms or get in touch with the Trust to have that link. Importantly as well, if you don't want to be on the video, that's everyone apart from our panel, don't have a choice, but if you don't want to be on video, please let Clint know. So Clint's standing up the back there, the tall fella back there, and he can do some magic with blurring you out, so that's excellent. Thank you also to the SA Water Library for the loan of the painting of Chowla Dam, which is over here. So quite fascinating to see what could have been represented in that way, so I encourage you to definitely check that out. And of course, thank you to our panel for sharing your stories with us today. Now, to introduce our topic and our panel. Damming the Dam, the Chowla controversy and its legacy. What happened to Chowla Dam? Built in 1960 as the antidote to SA's water security issues, by 1971 the plans were shelved, the tramway pulled up, and Dartmouth Dam in Victoria was the front runner. We will hear from our panellists as they share their stories and recollections of that whirlwind time when salinity, water security and economic survival were hot topics on the political agenda. I would say they're still pretty hot topics on the political agenda today. Now to our panel, and to introduce you, Amanda Wells. Amanda is an environmental historian and PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle, researching citrus growing in the Riverland during the 1950s and 60s. Her interest in the Chowla Dam is personal. Her grandfather, Roger Wells, was a soldier settler and citrus grower in Coultong from 1950 until the mid-1980s. Amanda's article on the Chowla Dam was awarded the 2024 Wakefield Press Essay Prize. Ray Naja, returning panellist from last year, while completing his leaving honours at Glossop High School, Ray was awarded a cadetship with the Engineering and Water Supply Department and was stationed at the Chowla Dam site. From the project's inception in 1964 until 67, he gained hands-on experience as a trainee draftsman, survey technician and design draftsman. Ray was responsible for producing on-site drawings that supported crews during the investigation phase of the proposed dam. And Mark Stokel. Mark was a teenager when the Chowla Dam was first proposed in 1959. The southern bank of the proposed dam was on Mark's property, was to be on Mark's property. the village, workshops, accommodations, administration, railhead, all on Mark's family property. There were experiments and investigations to determine design parameters shared by engineers on site, and Mark was aware and came across a lot of the political, water and environmental intrigues involved with the building of the dam, and has briefed many visitors over the years on the proposal. So each of our panel today will share their recollections and stories before we will open the floor for questions, and plenty of time for discussion and questions. Following which we'll have another excellent afternoon tea put on the library by the library staff this afternoon. So without any more from me, I'll hand over to Amanda.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to echo the acknowledgement of the traditional owners, the Irrigation people. And I think it's an important note, considering how massive this proposed dam was going to be, that this would have inundated more than just Irrigation country. It would have been over the border into Marawa and Mintate and Lachi lands as well. So it's important to remember that even though in the archives, and most of my knowledge comes from archives, that element isn't mentioned too often anyway by most people. But we should keep that in mind when we think about this impressively large dam. So yes, as James said, the reason that I'm here is because when I was diving into my PhD research, I opened a Murray Pioneer edition in the 60s. I just dived into the mid-60s because it was intimidating to look at all 1948 to 1970, and I chose a random year in the 60s, and there was all this talk about this massive dam. And geography was not my strong suit. I'm not very good at directions, etc. But I was pretty sure there wasn't a giant dam that's on the border of South Australia, so I had to dive in and look at this, and I was fascinated by this idea of a dam that didn't happen. So that's what drew me in. And the reason, as you also said, my grandfather was a soldier settler out at Cooltong, so that's what drew me to this topic overall. And my dad, Sandy, is in the front row. He was born in Renmark in 1956, so that's enough positioning of me. Yes, didn't know about it, now know about a lot about it and have written about it. So the Chowla Dam began after the trauma of World War II. Australia's leaders turned their attention to nation building projects, and there was a deep belief in the power of engineering and infrastructure to shape the future. And the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, which began in 1949, it became a celebrated symbol of this new post-war optimism, and it was framed as a technological marvel and a multicultural achievement. So South Australians, I'm sure most of you remember this, so I'm sorry for repeating the history that many of you lived, but South Australians watched the Snowy scheme with interest, and Premier Thomas Playford had his own ambitions to build legacy. Although he had to be convinced of the case for a South Australian water storage, by the late 1950s he was in the process of planning with the engineer-in-chief Julian Dryden. Besides nation building, the trend of big engineering in the mid-century and adding to Playford's legacy, a dam for South Australia was meant to ensure South Australia's water security and economic future, because without improved water access, modelling would show at the time that South Australia would have to limit its development plans and population plans. By the 1970s, Playford often said that South Australia would run out of water by the 1970s, and that was part of his justification. So the project was officially announced in 1960, and the idea was very bold. It was a massive dam that would store nearly 5 million megalitres of water, enough to underpin expansion of irrigation, support new industries, and ensure that South Australia's population, including in Adelaide, had its fair share of water to continue towards the 21st century. And as you'll see in the maps and the slides, or there's a perfectly timed one, it was going to be huge. It would be constructed on the old extensive Chowla Cowpram station lands, and it wasn't going to be deep, but it was going to bloat the Murray all the way up when it was full, it would go beyond Lock 9 out towards Wentworth, which if you have driven that way, it's a very, very long drive, so that's a massive dam. So the River Murray waters are governed by all three Murray states, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, and the dam had to be agreed upon by the River Murray Commission because of that, including the Commonwealth Government. And this begins some of the political drama of Chowla Dam. And I don't need to tell this audience that there's some traditional tensions between the states about the River Murray's waters. We don't even call the river the same thing. Here we would tend to say River Murray, and there they say Murray River. And I always feel very embarrassed when I'm speaking to academic audiences if I get it wrong, because I am South Australian, despite my university being in Newcastle. So while all the states and the Commonwealth agreed to the Chowla Dam by November 1963, it's fair to say that the eastern states weren't entirely convinced of why they should be helping to fund the dam that seemed to only benefit South Australia. But speaking of costs, the proposal estimated that the dam, at the beginning, they proposed an estimate of £4 million. When we converted to dollars in 1966, that became roughly $8 million. And if you've built anything, you know that costs tend to escalate, and inflation, etc., etc. But by 1967, when tenders came in at $70 million, somewhat higher than $8 million, that was cause for concern. So it was these ballooning figures that justified the Commission pausing works on the dam while they investigated. And the costs were a handy and easily explained justification for re-evaluating the dam, but there were also concerns being raised about the feasibility of the dam. As we all know, the climate that makes this region so good for horticulture, lots of sunny days, it makes for an environment prone to higher evaporation than rainfall. Early studies on evaporation had convinced the engineering chief and his team that Chowla would be feasible. But this was disputed as scientific expertise and technology rapidly evolved in the 1960s. Access to more precise measurements and complex computational technology allowed for more accurate modelling, and evaporation concerns were a frequent question for Chowla. In addition, concern was raised about the impact that the dam would have on the water table. And another thing that we all know, salinity is a problem in the River Murray, and it becomes more of a problem the further downstream the water flows, and that's due to the water picking up salt particles as it goes, runoff from irrigation, which was steadily increasing across the 20th century, and evaporation. And adding to the normal concern of salinity was the fact that in 1965 we began a very severe drought, the most severe of the last century. And the lack of fresh water being introduced into the river exacerbated salinity levels, which began to have marked effects on horticulture, especially downstream. And my research is into citrus growing, so I was very interested to see reports of salt water burning the leaves on the trees, impacts on the roots and everything. And in the 1960s, it's interesting to know that they were still trying to figure out the parameters of what certain plants could handle in terms of salinity. So Ian Tolley's work and Max Till's work on trying to figure out what they could handle, what they couldn't handle, how they could mitigate these things that's part of my thesis anyway. Stay tuned for that if you're interested. It even managed to the saltwater managed to defoliate a lot of trees, which is obviously not particularly good for their health or the health of your pocket if you're relying on the citrus for your income. So in August 1967, the height of the drought, when the River Murray Commission paused the dam, it raised considerable concern for South Australians, and especially those who were living up here in the Riverland. And in the article that I've written about it, which will be coming out this year, I've tried to portray for a national audience just how desperate this situation felt for many Riverlanders at the time. Perhaps because people upstream have a certain idea of what the Murray's like, they might not understand the South Australian reliance on it and what it looks like and feels like in this particular part of its flow. In the archives, I could see how concerning this so-called pause on Chowla appeared for South Australians, which leads me to more political context. In 1965, we not only had the beginning of the drought, but it was the end of the Playford era. For the first time in many people's lifetime, Labor won in South Australia. And it was initially, the party was led then by Frank Walsh, but Don Dunstan took over the leadership in '67. So perfect timing for this political issue of Chowla. And the Chowla pause played a big role in the subsequent '68 state election. Both Labor and the Liberal and Country League, LCL, campaigned in the Riverland and made promises about their party's plans to secure South Australia's water rights and to push for Chowla. But when the 1968 election results were equally split, it was independent MP Tom Stott from the Riverland seat of Ridley who held the balance of power, and he sided with the LCL. And Steele Hall became Premier. After a lot of wrangling, it took a while for that election to be announced. Stott's advocacy for Chowla was seen as a central point in his decision to back Steele, along with the fact that Hall made Stott Speaker of the House. When the issue arose again in April 1970, Hall and Stott made it a government-breaking moment, and Stott refused to vote with the LCL to ratify the alternative dam site in Victoria at Dartmouth on the Midda River. And the South Australian House of Assembly was dissolved, sending the state to an early election. So, having been raised myself in a post-Dunstan world and unfamiliar with this dam that didn't happen, I was amazed to see how much power this Chowla issue had in that particular part of our state's political history. Dunstan has a fairly good reputation in my neck of the woods. Not necessarily Labor and those sorts of things in other places, but it was sadly Dunstan that finally agreed to ratify Dartmouth in 1971. But this was past the era of big engineering, and we had enough scientific backing to say that it would have been a bad idea to build this dam, despite people still being convinced of the need for water storage in South Australia for understandable reasons. So we know, of course, that it would have been environmentally disastrous to have actually built the dam as designed. And another name that kept popping up in my research, Jack Seacamp. He told the River Murray Commission consultations between when the dam was paused and when the final report was released, which sort of signed the deal to close off Chowla, that the local ecologies wouldn't have supported it, and that's borne out in research since. So Jack's public advocacy for the river and its many salinity woes only accelerated after the Chowla issue, and I think that would be interesting for people to follow through the archives who, like me, were unfamiliar with this, that this salinity issue keeps popping up, and so does Jack Seacamp's name, Salty Jack. But I'll finish my little overview of history, and I'll pass on to some more lived experiences of what actually happened. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And also that article you mentioned, perhaps we can find a way to share that through the Trust with people here as well later in the year. So I'll pass on now to Ray Naja.
Thanks, James. Yeah, well, it was very interesting what Amanda said, because it started to wash away a few of the cobwebs, actually, because it's a long time back when I first started to kick the dirt around the floodplains of Chowilla. So what happened, as it was said, I was doing my leaving honours at Glossop High School, and fortuitously I was invited to an interview with the then resident engineer, Russell Dan, and he was looking for, at those days, he was looking for helping people to work out in the bush, which a lot of the city kids didn't want to do, and he offered me a cadetship, and of course I was at the stage in my life where I was planning to go to university, but I felt, well, why not work and do it while I make some money while I'm doing it? And that made a lot of sense to me, and it was one of the best decisions I made in my life at that time, to take up that role at Chowilla, even though it meant living away from home, all the nice comforts of what mum and dad used to provide us teenage kids in those days. So anyway, August 1964, I moved into the camp, and I immediately was sort of taken on a bit of a tour around the site, because by that stage they'd cleared a lot of the actual line where the dam was going to be built, and there's some really great photographs which you can all look at later, showing what it was like then and how it's grown back today. You wouldn't even know that there was a clearing from the floodplain from the east side of the Murray to the west side where the Renmark Wentworth Road is. The first thing that was important in the thinking, because when I arrived it was all go. Yeah, we're going to build this dam. Hook or by crook, it was going to happen. And we started doing boreholes, and what we had to do, and I'm going to explain something on the whiteboard in a minute, we had to work out, and salinity was always in the back of the mind of everybody that was doing the engineering work. They really understood the fact that if we build a dam over a floodplain like Chowilla, there's a hell of a lot of salt water underneath that floodplain. And once you put another 30, 40 feet of water on top of that, you create a hydraulic problem, which then pushes that salt from down, pushes it to where you've got virtually no resistance. So they call it a hydraulic grade line. You put water up here, it'll always try to find a lower spot somewhere else. So the pressure of the fresh water that was being stored would push that salt water under the dam back into the lower levels. And of course, that's why Jack Seacamp became very anxious about the whole idea, because he realised that a lot of that salt water would have ended up back in the river. And it would have put, as Amanda's rightly said, I remember my father saying, even when we moved to Monash, it was 1956, 57, and we had some awful years where our orange trees had a lot of burn on the leaves because of that salt water. So I understood that part, but what I didn't understand, and I love the term you use, Amanda, about big engineering, because it's something that if we didn't have big engineering today, none of us would be in this room. Where Renmark wouldn't have even happened. The Chaffee brothers wouldn't have started a program here in the first place. We wouldn't have the locks and weirs which created navigation on the Murray today. And there are issues for and against all of that. Whether you like it or you don't like it, there are things that sometimes have to happen if civilization wants to survive and live and grow. So and let's face it, big engineering replaced big engineering, because we got Dartmouth, and Dartmouth's a much bigger engineering project than Chowilla would have been anyway, and much more beneficial to the state, as it turns out. So we did a lot of work doing boreholes, soil testing. We did the hydrology of the river. We mapped the river from Go to Woe, both the Murray, the Chowilla Creek and the Monument Creek, so that we could work out how we were going to build the structure over that entire length of that dam, which was something like about, I don't know, I'm guessing a bit, but I think it was something like about 2 miles all up. You might 3 1/3 miles, not kilometres. Okay, so there you go. I knew it was a long way, but I didn't think it was that far. So anyway, we did all that. The other mention Amanda importantly mentioned was the Indigenous people's homeland in those days, and unfortunately, being very ignorant of any of that, it wasn't even talked about. And a couple of times when we were looking for sand for making concrete, we took sand from where we shouldn't have taken it, because there were Aboriginal artefacts in some of those sand. Because what used to happen when the floods happen, often you get the washed white sand up onto the floodplain, and that creates a perfect burial ground for Indigenous people. They used to do that traditionally for probably thousands of years. So that was another reason that we unexpectedly came across. So just for people's information, so if you're out on the floodplain anywhere and you see a beautiful heap of white sand, remember what could be in that, what could be buried in it. Because there's no records, and no one would know that was the case wherever you went. The site itself was good fun from a living point of view. There was a great camp. We had a mess. We had little bunks. Each had our own room. We played a few pranks on various people at times when they weren't looking, like digging holes. People would park their cars behind the bunks, and we would, in the middle of the night, we'd dig a big hole behind the back wheels so that when they reversed out, well, you know what the result of that was. So you were a bit cheeky, but you know, that's what you do when you're a heap of blokes living in a camp. You've got to do something to amuse yourself. We even went spotlighting on your property, your dad's property in those days, but he didn't mind that. He didn't mind us going around getting rid of rabbits. So that was another aspect of life at Chowilla. More back on the technical side, we came up with a plan for the salinity we thought would prevent the salinity moving downstream, and it was called a bituminous cut-off wall. And it was we developed with a company called Soil Mechanics Limited of London. They were engaged by the South Australian government to come up with a plan to figure out how we could actually, if we were going to build that dam, how we could slow that salinity movement from the top to the bottom. And there was going to be a series of cut-off pumping stations, deep bores below the dam for the total distance, and that would actually, a bit like what we have today. Everyone knows about the salt interception schemes that we've got, picking up the irrigation pressures from the high land that goes back into the river. It was very much the same principle. It was a series of salt interception pipeline, and then there was at the western end of the where the highlands started again. They installed a 4,000 metre length pipeline, which was about at least 4 or 5 foot diameter. I called it the biggest rabbit warren now in Australia, because as far as I know it's still there, and it was 4,000 odd metres of pipe built from that western side of the dam out to a place called Tilmy Flat, and that's where they were going to pump that salt water and hopefully have it evaporate and then mine the salt in the future, and hopefully none of that would work its way back to the river. A bit like what we're currently doing today with both the Waikerie scheme and the scheme south east of Loxton. So all those things were considered, but then the big elephant in the room, of course, was evaporation. And when you've got a body of water that's only going to fill maybe 1 year in 10, it tells you something about the fact that we're taking huge risks on. Yes, we wanted water storage for South Australia. South Australia was the poor cousin of the River Murray's water agreement. It only had about 1,500 gigalitres of actual allocation. Mind you, in saying that, if you look at the records for the last 100 years, the flows over the border in those 100 years has never, very rarely been below 4,000 or 5,000. But of course that's not enough if you're talking about the lower lakes, the evaporation losses on the lower lakes, and keeping the Murray mouth open. So there were issues that had to be all brought into the discussion, into the account, that you could not justify holding back all that water here, having losses of probably 1 to 1.5, if not even in a bad summer up to 2 metres, in a wet summer maybe 1.5 metres of evaporation loss.
And a lot of the lake was shallow. As you move back past Lake Victoria, I don't know if people realise, but when you drive to Mildura, there's a section of the road that drops quite low down, and you can actually look look north as you drive towards Mildura. It's it's about here, and you look across. Well, that in a strong wind, we worked out that the winds would create a big enough wave to actually cross that road. So that was going to be another. There would have had to been a big levee bank put against the highway or raise the highway, one of the two, to stop that from happening. So that was another one of the things that we learned. I'm going to, if this cord's long enough, I'm going to try and go over to the whiteboard. Later on, we can have a look at that. That was we built what was called I've lost the name now. An obelisk, is it? Obelisk. Yeah, and what happened, you stood behind this, and it tells you where you are and what all things. Mark, if you want to grab that. So I can explain it a bit later on. But one of the things we have to understand with this system, and we know how many dry years we get before we get a wet year, and you can almost scale that back to. If you look at the records I went to the Queensland when I was doing the Murray-Darling Association gig for about 11 years. I spent a lot of time in various department offices, and there's a great map in Queensland that shows that the cycle is about 1 year in, it can be as much as 1 year in 10, but it's more likely 1 year in 18 where we get major floods. So having this massive storage here above Renmark, so flooding that area there, wasn't going to fill very often. As I said, it might have filled 1 year in 10, because as we know, having the water back up here at Dartmouth, the evaporation is much, much lower, and we've always got that security. And we've been able to, by fighting with the interstate governments, as we've done more recently, we've been able to get our allocation increased. We've also been able to get our storage actually held in security, so that when Dartmouth does fill and spill, it's not just South Australian water. They used to say, well, Victoria and New South Wales have got two big slots. They go 50-50, and South Australia's water was on the top. I said, hang on, that means that's going to go first, and so we miss out. Anyway, we had to fight like buggery to get that changed. And but that was much, much later than when we're talking about with Chowilla. We didn't know about, well, we knew about it, but we couldn't do anything about it because there was a guy called Dethridge. I don't know if anyone knows the word Dethridge. It's the name of the wheel that they use for irrigation outlets in Victoria and New South Wales. So Minister Dethridge stood on the banks of the Goulburn River, and I think the year was about 1929, and his famous statement, which is recorded into one of the State Rivers manuals, any water past this point is a waste. That was his attitude towards being a Victorian, but what can you expect? Anyway. So I probably just about, how am I going for time? Like a bit more. Yeah, so one of the other things that's very important here, and I'll just drop this over the back. So you've got the floodplain, you've got the Monument Creek, the Chowder Creek. Oh, and by the way, one of the other things we did do, which was to the advantage to this day, was we built some beautiful concrete structures across both those creeks. So that's made access to those areas. Actually, and I saw the biggest monotillers in my life between those two bridges one day when we were working out there. The monitor lizard stood up, and I swear his head was about the height of my head, but he was still about 100 feet away, so I didn't hang around, but he didn't either. He went the other way, because they don't like people anyway. So what the important point about this, I'm sorry if I've got my back to you, Jeff. What we've got here, you see the blue, the black, and the red. So one of the things we learned when we started putting boreholes through this system And this is something I wish Jack Seacamp was here to understand today, because one of the arguments we always had with Jack was, yeah, there's a salinity problem, but it can be managed if it's dealt with properly. So what we learned, that when the river was running normally, there was always a lens of fresh water close into the river. Even it would extend out to 50 to 100 metres, depending on the soil profile either side. So if the river actually dropped in level by half a metre, the only water that would get back into the river from that area would have been fresh water. If you drop the river down severely, then you bring the salt water in, and of course we know about the irrigation pressures that come from the highland, push that salt water back into the river. That's why I've made this all red. So there's always a tendency, if the river's not running full, for salt to get back into the river. So that's why we built these salt interception schemes where we built them. But there's been times when we've had a drought, and we argued strongly that you can actually drop the river by half a metre at the weirs to keep the lower lakes not going below sea level. That was another argument that we had. So we said, right, if we do that, we're not going to be pulling salt water back into the river. We're only going to be pulling that fresh water lens as long as we stay in that vein. And it's something that the borehole logs actually taught us. By having done all that work at Chowilla, we understood very much better about the geology and the geography of the system. So that was another point. I'm sure other things will come to me later on in question time, but I think I'll call it quits there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, judging by the turnout, it's certainly a very popular topic, and it's really great that people like Amanda are doing a PhD and sort of researching all this information so it'll be readily available and not forgotten. But it was a big project. It was just massive. It affected so many people. And I'm sure most of the people in this room will relate to it in some way. They knew about it, or they had family involved in it, or lost land, or it was a big political thing, and everybody in South Australia wanted it. They wanted it so badly for all those reasons that have been covered. The big engineering, we wanted our share. The South Australian government felt vulnerable on water security from the other states, and they were always scared that we're at the bottom end. So if they had a dam where it is, then it would catch all the flushes from the whole of the Murray system. And the post-war Playford psyche then was to engineering big projects. Anyway, you've covered a lot of that, but everybody wanted this. They wanted it so badly. The politics of it changed governments several times, and the vision that Mr. Playford broadcast was really described well in that painting over there. There's this vision of this magnificent wall across the river valley, and a majestic lake way back up to nearly to Wentworth, and just like that. And when I took visitors to have a look at this site, they'd say, well, where was it going to be, and what's it going to be? Well, when I explained that that we were viewing from about 100 feet up on the valley, that the water would come 1/3 of the way up the cliffs. Oh, that all. That it's only going to be 36 feet deep, which is about as deep as the water is at Queen's Bend and the Bunyip Reach cliffs. There's just as much water as in the river itself. But it would go back 500 square kilometres to give it the volume. And this was a selling point. It was going to be the biggest dam in Australia, bigger than Yukonbean. Yukonbean was only a miserable 9 Sydney harbours, whereas Chow was going to be 12 Sydney harbours, and they hadn't thought of, they were only thinking about Lake Argyle then, which is 20 Sydney harbours. So it was a big ticket item, and South Australians really believed it was solved their water security problems. It was going to generate so much economic activity in all regards. The I don't know, where are we? At the regional level, the important people are the people, and the regional level, the local farmers and irrigators in the Riverland, they needed this water. They wanted security. They wanted to ensure they could expand their crops, and the government managed to successfully tender for the dam. The River Murray Commission are the people that put up the dam. They'd done the Snowy Mountains, they'd done Yarrawonga and a whole heap of other things, and there were 3 sites in South Australia they were going to choose. One at Teal Flats, one somewhere else, and one at Chowla. And it just had this strong local support. There were going to be 500 workers involved in the project. They had to be housed, and the state government, they had the wherewithal to do it. Okay, we need a railway line. All right, okay, South Australian Railways build a railway line. We need rail trucks. Okay, Islington Railway Works, build me 60 flat tops to cart the rock into the dam. Need housing. Housing Trust, go do your thing. Oh, we need the geology. Mines Department. So the Mines Department came out and did all the bores for the geological investigation, and so there was just a lot of people, a lot of employment, and nearly everybody in South Australia knew someone who was going to be involved in this massive dam in one way or another. At the site, dealing with people at the site level, Ray's already talked about the little community out at the village. There were 12 homes out at the dam site. There was another village built in Paringa, and it's just great. Housing Trust. Oh, Mr. Housing Trust, we need more houses for 500 workers, and so the state government had the wherewithal and the control to do these things. And and they had the state government had the sole tendering capacity on behalf of the River Murray Commission to build this dam. The people that were involved in it, they developed their own little community. They had a lot of fun, and many locals would have read the lovely article that Jenny Sanders wrote about the early days out at the dam site, and what that meant to those people. There were friendships formed with some of the kids, the engineers going to the local school, and it would have made a big difference to the whole structure of the local community. There was another group of people really affected this, and these are the landowners. This 500 square miles was owned by people who had farmers and graziers, and they were going to lose their really valuable drought proofing they had on their stations for their stock. And this was a pretty traumatic thing. We had this unique area where you take, let's take Charles Station for instance. They had all of that wetland area that had permanent grazing, permanent water, to enhance their back country, their back dryland country, and that was going to be taken away from them. And you had Millwood, Boundary Point, Millwood is just a citrus place. Lindsay Point, all of Lindsay Point floodplain was resumed, as was Berrabee, Ned's Corner and so forth, and likewise on the other side with Colkerna. And this was pretty traumatic for a lot of these people. Some people handled it better than others. Some saw it as an opportunity and sort of gave up their land and then moved on to other things. Charla, for instance, they bought another property down the southeast to drought-proof their grazing enterprise, and so different people did it different ways. When they called quits on the dam, many were able to lease back the land. Some of the land went to National Park. Berrabee's now a National Park, as is Millwood, Ned's Corner, and and Charla was leased back at the time, and we were fortunate at Bunyip Reach because the headworks were going to be built on our property. They wanted to take a whole heap of highland of good country, and my dad wanted to wait for the dam to be finished and see how much land they really did want, so he didn't have to lose as much, and that extended the consultation. And of course they said hold it before they took over the land. So we got lucky. We managed to retain our land, as did the farm at Boundary Point as well. So that's a little bit of an aspect of the people that were involved in it. I just see the failure of the proposed Charla Dam in favour of one at Dartmouth was one of the best things that ever happened. It gave leverage for Steel Hall to use to negotiate a one-off permanent increase in South Australia's entitlement since Federation. And that was the leverage he had over the other states, because the other states, they had already agreed to this dam through the River Murray Commission, and it was legally set, and so South Australia could insist to go ahead with it. To get the other states out of it, they said, okay, we'll give you an increased share because we'll have the Dartmouth water to back an extra entitlement up to South Australia. So that was that part of the legacy of Charla has been really important to South Australia. It did create environmental issues were not an issue back when they thought this stuff up in the 50s. It was big engineering. If there's an environmental problem, you solve it with engineering. Well, some environmental problems you can only solve by not engineering, and Charla was one of them. But it did create an awareness. Jack was anybody that opposed the dam like Soggy Jack. No one wanted. It was an unpopular thing to oppose the Charla Dam, but it did create a community awareness of salt issues, and led to the big study that GHD did in the early 70s that showed there was salt coming around the lochs into the river, that there were salt mounds underneath irrigation areas, and that there was natural infeeds of salt into the saline water into the system from the regional groundwater in places like Woolpunda, along those Woolpunda cliffs. Thirdly, it saved a magnificent wetland and forest all the way from Charla up to Wentworth.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to our panel. Incredibly interesting to hear from setting the scene to the lived experience, and continually fascinating to picture, what it could have been or what it would have looked like for our area and community around here. So we're running very well on time, so thank you very much for our panel. We'll move now into some questions. So what we'll suggest is, if you do have a question, to raise your hand, and either if it's for a particular panel member, direct to them, or we can have it open for the panel. So perhaps fire away and introduce yourself and see how we go. Very good. I'll bring this. This should be pretty good.
There's so few people sticking their hand up, I'll make too quick.
Thank you very much. First question, they're both very minor questions. Mark, the small collection of graves that is on the hill behind the Customs House, were they moved up there in anticipation of the flood, or were they always in that spot?
They were always in that spot.
Okay, just a little curiosity. And Amanda, because of your studies, I wonder if you could enlighten me as to where the name Nellwood comes from, because none of the locals seem to know.
Unless Mark can like us.
Do you know?
I do not know, but I love the question like that, and I will write it down and get back to you. Unless you have further on that, Mum.
Yes.
Yes?
Not quite. It's just that if you're doing research, it was originally going to be called the Murtho Dam. Then they discovered that the Murtho is a Aboriginal, rather unsavoury Aboriginal word, so it became Charla Dam.
More detail?
Nellwood, it was Nell's wood, it sort of, you know. It must have been a lady, huh?
And I was disappointed to learn that about Murtho as well, Tony, so I'm interested to find the meaning there. Through the middle here.
Don't try to do that, we live there.
Yeah.
Actually, not so much a question, but an exercise. If we're talking of Chowla, if we go up a bit further to Lake Victoria and Loch 7, we've got an exercise there where towards the end of the 1940s, the government got a company in to put more bank money, to raise the level of Lake Victoria. And of course, as we know, that every gallon of water is about 10 pounds in weight. So when you're talking about so many gallons, you know, or weights, there's a lot of water involved. Now what's happened today, you can see where the salt, or the water that the good water has been sitting on, has pushed it out, where nowadays they've taken that back out of the line of Lake Victoria. I think it's about 10 k's out, where the water, salty water is. What I'm saying here is a good example of what would have happened if Chowla had gone ahead. This is what I'm talking about. There's quite a lot of dead wood, late native trees that have died in that area between the bank of Lake Victoria and the Murray just below Loch 7.
Yes, Ted, there was a program between Lake Victoria and Loch 7, and there's some salt interception wells that have taken care of, are trying to remedy that problem so that they can revegetate. But that's the whole situation with anywhere along this river system, that we've always got that hydraulic grade line between any irrigation or any storage is going to always move water in the ground below it, somewhere where it'll take the point of least resistance.
one of the things I didn't explain was that what we did, and I started to mention it, about saw mechanics, they actually came up with a bituminous cut-off wall that we were going to install underneath the actual wall of the dam, and it was going to go down about 80 to 100 feet. Now we did an experiment. I know I've got a drawing of it, but I searched for about 4 hours last night and I couldn't find it. But I could draw it on the whiteboard. But effectively, we did an experiment. We got a clamshell. We dug a square about 80 feet deep, and then we filled it up with bentonite, slurry, so that it remained stable. And then we tried to use a big tube and pour bituminous concrete through the tube and push the bentonite up, so we could actually create a square of bituminous concrete. Then we were going to plug the bottom of it and watch and see how much water actually seeped through it, if at all. Unfortunately, the experiment got 3/4 of the way through about the time when they decided they weren't going to go ahead. So we never ever finished it. But we did record everything that we'd done to that point. So unfortunately, we still don't know whether it was going to be effective or not. But look, there's always going to be issues with salinity. We're in a pretty good shape at the moment. I mean, the river, the idea was to have 800 EC at Morgan. Now we're talking about 800 EC down at Wellington, and we're not even getting anywhere near that. Most of the time, if the river's running normal, and there's a certain flow through the lower lakes, especially Lake Alexandrina. Lake Albert's another issue because it's a dead end, but Lake Alexandrina is generally around the 400 or 500 mark. So we're in pretty good shape, and it's remaining that way. And I can say too, guys, that you've got no problem with your allocation, if I can be so bold as to say, if the Minister gives you a cut in allocations this year, he wants a smack, because there's a lot of water coming down from the floods, the Queensland floods, into the Warrego and the Prahru, and that's going to almost refill Menindee Lakes again. So it's looking pretty good. Dartmouth's in good shape. We just hope that the winter spill breaks on the human area and everywhere else, so that we get back to a reasonable figure.
Will I bring the yabbies back on?
How many others? Yes. Oh, let me get this to you.
Not sure who this is for, probably Amanda. I've heard it said that Playford really never believed in Chowler. There was always a political ploy against the upstream states and the Commonwealth to build Dartmouth. I don't know much credibility. Have you heard that story?
I think, like so much of politics, it really depends on who you ask and when you ask. It's the same with Steele Hall and Don Dunstan. When who was for the dam and who was against the dam, it just depended on the moment and what was politically expedient for them at the time. But it depends also on which biography you read of Playford as to whether he believed in it or not. And I think it did appeal to his sense of legacy. Not that he needed that much more, considering what he managed to achieve in his time in office. But yeah, it is one of those things that you'll never truly know unless you're the man himself, probably.
There's a great story about Tom Playford. I mean, as we know, he was the guy that instigated the Morgan-Whyalla pipeline. But he and Frank Walsh would often, on a Friday evening, would grab their kit bags. They never had 10 or 15 helpers. They might have had 1 or 2 in those days. They would grab their kit bags and go down to the pub and then say to Frank, "Okay, Frank, let's sort out what we're going to vote on next week, and let's not have an argument."
Yeah, just very quickly. Mark, you talked about the depth of the Chowler Dam, well, that's been spoken of, and how shallow it was. Was there an issue with comparing the potential volume of the Chowler Dam with Dartmouth? I know Dartmouth is super deep, and I think you've got a number on that, Mark. But 500 feet. And the comparative volumes, did Chowler have it over Dartmouth in the volume, or?
Yes.
So that was an argument to promote the Chowler thing, but obviously science reigns supreme.
That's a bad sign. I just want to add to the politics of the area. There's a wonderful story how Steele Hall, when he realised that he was losing the battle to keep Dartmouth, or had been convinced, to keep Chowler, or had been convinced that Chowler shouldn't go ahead. He said, well, I'll only support that if we get that extra storage that Mark talked about. And the story is that the South Australian Treasurer and Steele Hall, our Premier, went over to meet with the President of the Commission and said, we'll agree to this if you give us extra water. And the Commissioner was saying, I'm not going to do that, you're not getting any more water. And then in that tone, the South Australian Treasurer started to concede a little bit that, oh, well, we'll give up. And Steele Hall kicked him under the table in the shin. And he got his 1850 water. So it went from 1547 to 1850, and we still have that. And that was probably more important to us in the end than anything else. So 1850 gigalitres.
Which is still not enough.
Still not enough, I agree, mate.
Who do we kick?
But that's what
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'd just like to make a comment, if I could, a question. David Bowden, I was at Berriview Station, and we were displaced as a result of Chowler, so I come up here to re-engage, and it's because I make an observation. My whole life I've been telling people why we left Berriview and Renmark because of this dam, and when you stand there and say that it was going to flood our homestead to 18 feet, and the evaporation rate, I understand, is about 5 feet a year, is that right, Mr. Clayton? And it was going to be discovered, and you go through the basic numbers of depth, of evaporation rate, and the extent of the damage it's going to do to the environment as well. And when you have had to spend your whole life explaining what has happened, I don't think anybody has ever sort of said, well, it's not obvious there was a problem. They've all said, you've got to be joking. And one of the questions I've always had is, how is it that governments can make such a mistake on the fundamentals like that, and the impact it has on people? And I've been involved in the political scene a little bit over the years, and we've moved on to other things, and I come up here to re-engage for that reason. I've had a great fondness for the area, and the displacement for us was terrible, but you just have to accept what's happened. But I just look back and wonder how, with all the stats and all the information as you presented it here, how a decision could have been made to undertake it, apart from the fact that it affected us. So more a comment, and that's one of the reasons my father, Jeff, got heavily involved in politics. And I've sort of followed an interest in that because we need the input in to get the right decisions, and you need the challenges at the time to push them back, and obviously there wasn't pushback.
Any comments on that from the panel?
Yeah, David, that's an interesting comment. I was never able to understand right from the early stage. I was only a young bloke then, but what's still hangs one. How they could, why they wanted to do it. Because I knew about the evaporation, the 5 foot evaporation, and the seepage problems, and it was known stuff. I did I researched an essay back in 1961, and in it there is a little chapter on the problems. Seepage and salt was one of them, and evaporation was the other one. So it was a known issue. The engineers that I interviewed at the time, they knew about that, knew about these issues. But it's just that the numbers that the Boffins did in the River Murray Commission, it seemed to stack up okay. They built Lake Victoria, and that was a successful lake. The seepage problems hadn't shown up there by then, and this was just going to be a bigger version of it. And it's a very good question how they could make that mistake, but yeah, the big thing was when the quotes came in 3-4 times more than what they were expecting, they suddenly sat back and redid their cost-benefit analysis and found out their problems.
Actually, David, I think you should understand that the guys, the engineers at the time and the hydrologists started to argue in the beginning about the 56 flood. The 56 flood would have filled Chowilla about 5 times. So that was the first thing that they were thinking, oh, well, there's always going to be a 56 flood. Well, we got a bit of a flood in 74 that I can remember, 5. We haven't had that much high river between 75 and what we had 2 years ago. There's been some high rivers, but nothing dramatic. But that was what started the thinking. Tom Playford was conned a bit because I think I was a young guy thinking this is the best thing since sliced bread. Here I was. I actually argued with Steele Hall once in the theatre here as a young kid, thinking, what the hell are you? Why would you? You're only a politician. What the hell would you know? You know. But the 56 flood was the catalyst that started that thinking, because they thought, well, we've got to stop that. We've got to somehow control that, and that's what controls all the thinking and all the projects. I mean, we're very lucky we've got the Snowy Mountain scheme, but if you put the Snowy Mountain scheme up today, I guarantee you there'd be one hell of a fight to stop it. Yet it's been the backbone of the development in this state. If we never had the Snowy Mountain scheme, we wouldn't have the volumes of water we've got going down the river today. We would get high rivers and we'd get very, very low rivers because we wouldn't have that continuous supply.
Just as if I can make a comment, whenever this comes up, people ask me at dinner and different things from the background, and I try to explain what happened. And if I hold that up and say what we're going to do is to put a dam this deep, this big, and 5.5 feet evaporation a year, and I put my beer glass next to it, and said they went and did it at Dartmouth like that. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's my description.
Exactly.
Sorry, Andrew.
Any other takers, questions? I think our panel are all hanging around for afternoon tea, correct? So feel free to approach them then. Okay, if we don't have any further questions, we do have a small gift of appreciation for our panel. We do really genuinely appreciate the time you've taken to share with us all, the meetings you've had with Judy and Jeff to date in shaping this. So thank you again, and I'll invite Rosalie, Trust CEO, to say a few words and pass on a gift. So round of applause please for our panel.
And look, I just really want to say thank you. Everyone thanks you and appreciates what you've done. I know the amount of work that's gone into this, so I do want to thank Judy again, Dr. Judy Bailey, and Jeff Ball, who I first met when we documented the history of the Renmark Irrigation Trust, and he was the author of that particular book. So really appreciate his time. James failed to mention he's a volunteer. So we do love the work you do. In terms of our panel, really thank you very, very much. In terms of Amanda, look, I think it's great that you're documenting this story, and I really love what you're doing. Ray, well, the best thing that happened about the Chowler Dam is we got Ray at the Trust to help us rehabilitate our irrigation scheme, so that was fantastic. And for Mark, thank you. You're a great member of our community, and we appreciate that. So just a little token of appreciation coming to you. That one's ready.
That's Amanda's there.
That's Amanda.
Hey Ray, with all that knowledge and that, what did you feel at the time was going to happen? Would it be, would the dam be taking on, or would you vote against it?
Oh, no, I mean, once you understand the hydrology and the geography, you wouldn't be against it. You'd have to be. You'd have to be against it, because I'm having a fight now with the state government about the 1,000 square kilometres of fresh water we've got behind the barrages. If we could cut that in half, we could save this state over 500 gigalitres of evaporation loss a year. And that's coming out of our 1850. So evaporation is the elephant in the room. No one's taking any notice of it. When we built all of the locks and weirs, what we did, we created permanent wetlands that used to be ephemeral wetlands, which meant that during a flood they filled and they emptied. And now we've got permanent 200 square kilometres of wetlands between Wellington and the state border. Mind you, there's Vanrock's been fixed up, there's been a few that have been fixed up that can be filled and drained, but the bulk of them are still there, and we're losing a lot of water through all these backwaters that weren't permanent backwaters before the locks and weirs were. Mind you, would we go without the locks and weirs? No, we wouldn't. But what we haven't done, we haven't finished the job, and that's where I'm fighting for now. We've got to finish that job.
Very good.
Gets a squash bag.
Now, if you'd like to join the afternoon tea, it's just in the room adjacent here. So, thanks very much. Cheers.